Welcome, everyone. The room begins to fill up. I just wanted to the opportunity to hop into the chat. Feel free to introduce yourself, say hi to myself, to our guest this week, and to each other. And let us know where you're joining us from. And if you're a teacher, I'd love to know what it is you're teaching, who you're teaching, where you're teaching. Welcome, Doug. Welcome, Susie. Good to see familiar names in the chat. I think we've got some new folks as well registered today, so I'm looking forward to seeing everybody who ends up joining us from all over. Oh, awesome. All over the place. Thank you all for being here. And for those of you joining us late in the evening, as always, we appreciate it. Get started in about 20 seconds or so, just giving a few more participants a chance to join us before we get going. I'm afraid we might have just lost Deborah. Hopefully she'll be rejoining us in a minute. She was just with us, so hopefully she's back on. Always potential for internet trouble, so I'm sure she'll rejoin us any minute now. But while we're waiting, I will get us started. Just wanted to say hi and welcome everybody to our webinar today, Liberator and a Spy. We're excited to welcome back all of our experienced Echoes and Reflections educators and those of you who are joining us for the first time. My name's Jake. I'll be your behind the scenes support should you need it during our program. If any technical difficulties, please do let me know through the chat function. Any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and ask through the chat or the Q&A functions. We'll do our best to answer them at the end. And we do ask that you keep your questions relevant to the presentation and as always respectful to your fellow attendees. As I just said, speaking of technical difficulties, our guest Deborah Levine was just on and she's just fallen off of the panelists. So we're going to give her a minute to hopefully reconnect before we get started. But I guess I can read her bio while we're waiting. That's a good idea, I think. Deborah is the editor-in-chief of the American Diversity Report. She's an award-winning author of 18 books and a Forbes magazine diversity and inclusion trailblazer. She served as a speaker, consultant, and coach to nonprofits, government agencies, corporations, and universities. Her diversity work began in childhood in Bermuda as the granddaughter of one of its founding 400 and the only Jewish family to have lived on the island for 4 generations. She's also a Holocaust educator and a former executive with Jewish Federations, American Jewish Committee, AJC, and DuPage Chicago Interfaith Resource Network. Deborah is also a cognitive diversity inventor, and she uses the neuroscience of storytelling, emotional metrics, and decision optimization. Given her pioneering work as an IT office manager in the 80s, interfaith organizing founder in the 1990s, FBI security trainer in Tulsa after the Oklahoma City bombing, women's advocacy organizer in 2000, and inventor of the cognitive diversity system, Deborah has more than 33 years, 3 decades of experience as a change maker for a diverse world in challenging times.
Here we are.
All right, how's that? Hey, we did it.
Hey.
Wonderful.
Oh my
Okay,
gosh.
so Deborah, just means we're gonna have to move a little bit faster. I apologize. I hope you're okay with that.
So be it. This is life.
All right, and we've introed you.
Yes.
Read your bio, you are good to go. So I'm just going to turn it over to you in the interest of time.
Thank you. And I will go through the slides. I'll tell you when to go to the next one. And we'll start off with these photos of my father, both for the documentary Untold Stories of a World War II Liberator and the teaching guide that goes with it. And I want to share with you that this documentary was originally a radio theater, audio only, and then Jewish Life TV mentored me to help make it into a documentary that was broadcast across the world. I am so inspired by my father's stories. I will share with you, he did not talk about this when we were growing up. I did find this photograph of him, and I asked him, Daddy, you were in the military in the war. And mind you, I was just a kid. So I said to him, did you kill anybody, Daddy? And he said, no, but I slapped somebody once. What? What did you slap him for? And he said, he told me that the only thing he was sorry about in the war, he was a German Nazi, was that Hitler hadn't killed more Jews. So I stopped asking questions at that point because I couldn't handle it. And he didn't say much more, but he put books into our and my bedroom for me to read, including the Diary of Anne Frank. And when I asked him what happened to Anne, all he said was, she died and marched off. End of conversation. But I'm very fortunate, right, that towards the end of his life, he decided to share his stories with me and his letters, which he kept hidden away in a file cabinet in the back of his closet. And so I made them into this documentary, and you will be able to enjoy his letters, my mother's love letters to him during the war, and the letters of a Holocaust Polish survivor that were sent to me to include in the documentary. And so I will start, though, with the beginning back in Bermuda. Next slide. Right? Bermuda is actually the scenario of Shakespeare's The Tempest, where the magician Prospero was, and we felt the magic of the island always. In fact, I am part of the only Jewish family to have lived on the island for 4 generations. Right? One of the things about the island is that it was also a hub for American and British military operations during World War II. So having the Navy and the Army around us was very normal. My grandfather helped not only the Jewish personnel get housing, he was a realtor, but also Holocaust survivors who came through Bermuda on the way to the America at the end of the war. And it was wonderful to hear these stories. And as a kid, I just thought that was normal. I was the only Jewish little girl on the island. So it was amazing that during the war, my grandparents sent their daughters, and my mother was one of them, to America for safety. And Mom went to Radcliffe, Harvard, where she met my dad, and they married. And it was during the war. And they have never, ever really talked about what the war meant to them till much later. But my dad was an archivist, and he kept papers from that time. And I'd like to share with you one of the things that he kept. It is from 1941. It's the commencement speech at Harvard from the Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter. He was a Jew from Austria originally, and he understood the history of what was happening as the war unfolded. And this is what he had to say. Never before, I believe, have college commencements been so appropriate to the times, nor symbolic of all that we hold dear. For events compel us to reconsider the significance of our history, circumstances which even the most ostrich-like can no longer disregard. Challenge the worth of our past, the validity of the faith that founded this nation, and our power to vindicate it. And so he kept that to remind us that it is ongoing, that we must, right, vindicate it. Now, just on a personal note, I will share with you that one of the memories of that day was from my grandmother, who met Felix Frankfurter and mistakenly called him Mr. Hamburger. And we laughed about that for the rest of our lives. So sometimes memories come and go in different ways. We turn to the next slide, and you'll see the Radcliffe Harvard that my father and my mother and the grandparents were so enamored of. So much so, they sent me to Radcliffe also many years later. So let's take another look at the next slide. And you'll see again my father in his uniform and my mom with her beautiful smile. Right? And students will be surprised that after graduation, my father couldn't be drafted, as most gentlemen were, and he couldn't even enlist because he was too skinny. He didn't make the weight required. So he got jobs that weren't very good because there weren't many available. He was a door-to-door salesman for Hoover vacuums, and he was terrible at it. So he went on a diet of milkshakes and bananas and finally made the weight required and enlisted, right? And he headed out to boot camp in Battle Creek, Michigan, where he began training for the military police. I've always been fascinated that they chose him for that. They didn't know him as well as we did, but they did know him. And he described the experience at Camp Custer as brutal physically, but he was never again in the same excellent shape, right? And he rented an old attic room for my mom. Her name was Estelle. And she got a job teaching elementary school, which she loved and did for the rest of her life. But then he got a call. Next slide. And he said in his writing, there was a sudden call from headquarters to report to Camp Ritchie in Maryland. And Captain Cameron, Harvard Business School grad, and very supportive, said that I was to regard any transfer as absolutely secret. Right? And not until a PBS documentary came out in 2004 was there public knowledge, for the most part, of Camp Ritchie. And the Ritchie boys, as they called them, were young men whose families had fled Germany and had the psychology and the language embedded in them since childhood and knew what to expect more than anyone else. Now, my dad told them that he had acquired German and French in the classroom. His parents actually had immigrated from the Latvia, Ukrainian area, but his commanders didn't care. It was close enough. And so Camp Ritchie it was. So Dad wrote to Estelle this description of the training. Classes consisted of order of battle, interrogation and interpretation techniques, photo interpretation, and plenty of field work, pigeons, radio, and telegraph. There were lectures on military information and a tough 2-day exercise problem, which I gratefully managed to survive. Right? And survive he did, and deployed he was to Europe, specifically in the beginning to England, where he was a chauffeur for generals. I never understood that. But when he took us, and we were teenagers, to see where he had been in an army, he took us first up to Cambridge and where he had chauffeured generals. And one night in the middle of the night, because he was so tired, he unfortunately drove himself into a ditch, broke his arm in several places, ended up in the hospital, and missed the Normandy invasion. Now, I can't say I'm sorry about that because he did survive. And he ended up, though, in France Germany, Luxembourg, Belgium, during the rest of the war. And he was, yes, a spy. He would talk with people, ask, where did you see the Germans last? Where are they now? So that he could report to the military who actually fought what to expect, where to go, where not to go. He was not involved really in the actual firing of tanks and equipment like that. He did write one letter about spying regarding one major invasion in Belgium, I think it was, by the Nazis. And he wrote my mother, he said, "I'm all right, dear. Please don't worry, because I ran really, really fast," and hoping that he could calm my mother down. They were so sweet in those letters, right? But as towards the end of the war, he took on a different role, and that was interrogating Nazi prisoners of war, which is one of the things that the Ritchie boys were really focused on. Right? If you go to the next slide, right? Right? You'll see all of the troops marching through various parts of Europe. And one of the things that they found were various concentration camps. And he wrote in his letter to Estelle, "Some of them I've been able to see. They are incredible. One cannot convey the right smell and the impression made by 2,000 or 3,000 starved corpses, or the inexhaustible hungry eyes of still alive Jews and Russians, Poles and French. Be sure of one thing: terror in the Middle Ages was child's play compared to this." Next slide, please. The Polish Holocaust survivor who worked with me, or rather his nurse worked with me to send me his letters, will be quite visible in the documentary. And one of the things that he wrote was, "When we arrived at the labor camp in 1942, we were divided into groups, and these groups were assigned to munition factories. Life in the camp was hardly bearable because daily the Germans would remove a few people and shoot them. We never knew who would be next. In 1943, there was an epidemic of typhus in the camp. The Germans did not treat those who were afflicted. They shot them." It's amazing that this gentleman, his name was Leon Wiesband, survived. And thankfully, he kept his memoirs, and I'm able to put them into this Untold documentary so people can hear his stories personally. Because hearing the first view of it, of what it was like to be in this little Polish village, Zwolen, when the Nazis invaded, it's an incredible education. Next slide. This is my father trying to breathe, and my mother, trying to help him breathe, wrote to him every day. And she would say, "How are things with you? Is it very bad? Is it terribly uncomfortable? Do you work awfully hard? Damn this war anyhow. Aaron, darling, I love you very much, and I can't bear that you should be this unhappy. Aren't you due for a leave? A pass? Furlough? Something by now? Surely you need a break and a change, a chance to rest and relax and get out of Germany for a while. And they ought to do something about it. Shall I write to General Eisenhower? I don't think she ever did. But Dad did get a break. This is Marseille, southern France. He was smoking a cigarette. He did a lot during the war. Just, I don't know, to try and stay sane, along with reading books. And he wrote to my mother about what he was reading, poetry and books. And you'll see behind me, I am my father's daughter. So what did he do? Let's look at the next slide. And it's a letter to Mom, handwritten, right? And it's like many of the letters he wrote to her. And he said, I have talked to enough Germans in the past month to fill a good-sized section of Milwaukee, and all types, army generals and SA paramilitary bums like stormtroopers and brown shirts, miners and artists, professors, solid farmers and crafty businessmen, children, octogenarians, and spies. Confront them with the truth, and they cannot believe it. An army doctor, a major, once told me that he had been in Russia for a year. He had never once heard of any German atrocities. Oh, yes, they'd hung a few people one night and forgot to cut them down for days, but everything else was just propaganda. Oh, we go to the next slide as the war comes to an end. And every newspaper in the world started to talk about the end of the war, whether it was in Germany or Japan. It had to end. And as the war ended, my father's letters became more direct, pointed, and analytical. And this is one of the things he had to say. I'm gradually getting an idea of the problems in Germany. A large part of the population never belonged to the Nazi Party, but 99.9% blame Hitler only for losing the war. And they seem to suffer no pangs of conscience over the origin of the war or the ideology of the party. They know they are beaten. It's just a risk they took and they lost. They have no questions over the misery they brought to millions and hardly consider them, the victims, as human as themselves. And they doubt that Germany even started the war. Years of maleducation kept them ignorant and proud, selfish and egoistic, claiming Germany alone has suffered, and despite her righteousness. My goodness. Go to the next slide and you'll see that Dad did get a medal, a Bronze Star, in support of active combat operations as officer in charge of Military Intelligence Team number 402G. It's a translation team. And you would think that my father might have bragged about receiving this medal as we were growing up. Never. And he wrote to Estelle that he was just doing his job. And years later, when I found the photo and asked about it, he told me, well, they had all these medals. They didn't know who to give it out to. They'd given it to everybody. He had some left over, so they gave me one too. Right? And students need to understand that humility was a frequent trait of wartime heroes. And Dad was always like that. And he wanted to know what he was going to do next. He wrote to Estelle, next slide, please. Now things are getting near the end. I'm thinking or trying to think what to do. Maybe civil service, but unless it's really good, I'm not interested. The State Department, a little iffy. Maybe I go into business. But whatever I do, darling, be quite positive that it will be full accord of us both and with plenty of ambition and enthusiasm. And what you're looking at here is Bermuda's first shopping mall, Stop and Shop. And it was built in part by my grandfather, and my father was part of the process. It was unusual in those days in that it was located between the white and black communities, so both could go and shop there. So my dad decided to have a career in retail. But he also decided to move us back, right, to America, where we would be with a Jewish community. And I wouldn't be the only Jewish little girl. And so we went to Long Island. You know what it's like for a little girl to go from the 24 square miles of Bermuda, British colony, which didn't make cars legal for civilians till 1948, to New York, Long Island, not far out of New York City. Yeah, pretty much interesting and what we call a polyglot for young people who are exposed to different cultures very young. But it was during those years in America that we started to learn about Dad. If we go to the next slide, this is Dad many, many years later. After he retired from retail work, he became the chief financial officer of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. And here he is getting sort of an award from the Ohio Senior Citizens Council. And he is definitely at peace. But he decided that he wanted to make sure that history would be preserved and honored. And it's his role, not only in being the chief financial officer, but having a role in creating the American Jewish Archives along with the Rabbi Marcus. He was determined. Yes, in his spare time, I know that doesn't sound like it's much, but he taught poetry because poetry had kept him sane during the war, and it was always something that he would do. In his honor, right, I decided, in his honor and my mother's, to go into what we call the Jewish civil service. And if you look at the next slide, right, you'll see that I coordinated the 1990 National Workshop on Christian-Jewish Relations. You'll see the back of my head. I wasn't gray then. You'll also see Cardinal Bernardine, and you'll see Cardinal Villebrands. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Cardinal Villebrands, okay, he was part of the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, which produced the Nostra Aetate document distancing the church from preaching the concept of Jewish deicide, the killing of Jesus. About a decade later, Villebrands oversaw the creation of guidelines for implementing Nostra Aetate, which helps solidify that Judaism had an ongoing covenant with the divine. It rejected centuries-old conspiracy theories that Hitler had promoted, including how Jews were children of Satan and whose blood contaminated Christian communities. And there he is. By the way, he's a real sweetheart, as was Bernadine. It was a pleasure to work with him. We go to the next slide. It's also about that workshop. And what you're looking at here, that's me on the far right, and the gentleman standing next to me, his name is Jan Niemöller. He is the son of Martin Niemöller, who's a Lutheran pastor and someone who was an objector, an activist against Hitler. Students need to know about Niemöller. Jan, who is now passed, carried on his father's work. And the students, as I said, need to know about it and the famous poem that Martin Niemöller wrote. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. It's a lesson in do not be silent. Do not just observe when you see what is happening. You must object. And that was what I did when I moved to Tulsa after the Oklahoma City bombing and dealt with the neo-Nazis there. Was trained by the FBI in protecting the Jewish community. And let's see the next slide. This is where and when Holocaust denier David Irving decided that Tulsa was a good place for him. Now, students need to know about Holocaust denial and about David Irving, who is one of the most famous deniers in history. He arranged for a meeting in a room in a library in the mall in Tulsa under a fake name, called it Native American Constitution Party. And I'll share with you that my friends who were Native Americans were not happy in the least. So I went. My boss, who was like 6'4", said, "You are not going alone." I said, "Okay, come with me." And David Irving held up a letter, and he said, "This letter was written by Hitler, and it says he had nothing to do with persecuting Jews. He really liked Jews. And the only reason that the world doesn't know about this letter is that it was written in an ancient form of German that only he, David Irving, knew." I'm like, what? But everybody who was his fan in the room smiled and nodded and agreed. Very difficult times, and people need to know about it. And by the way, years later, David Irving spent 13 months in an Austrian jail for trivializing the Holocaust. And some years later, he actually made money taking people on tours through Auschwitz. Yeah. So we go and look at the next slide, where I am in Israel planting a tree in my father's honor. Right? I'm executive director of the Chattanooga Federation, an honor to do so on behalf of the Jewish community. I will share with you that one of the stops on the way to Israel was Uzbekistan to visit the Jewish community there. I got terribly ill, almost died, and was no longer Federation director. But it did give me time to be creative, to go through Dad's letters, to make the documentary, to write the memoirs of his letters, to be what Dad needed to carry on his legacy. And as he wrote, "Let us bother only with love in our striving, no regrets, only thanks. We cannot yield, even if only to count the lilies in the field." That's sort of what I did. And I share Dad's letters and stories to amplify his wartime goals of re-educating, which remain relevant today. This is what he said. "I want to see a complete re-education. A short talk with a boy from Hitler Youth would provide a very clear example. A conversation with a Nazi teacher who claims Germany's right to enter Czechoslovakia because of 15th century tradition would be another illustration. Well, we could remove the Nazis, make an attempt for re-education, in which incidentally we better succeed, but we have to go deeper, also to the cause of this war, the cause of Nazism. Why did this education arrive here in Germany, and what were its causes?" And I believe in doing what I do, right, that I look at this issue of education and what the Holocaust education role is in it, so that we move forward with a mindset of humanity. And so documentary and its teaching guide is designed to help students learn history from an individual perspective, putting a face to it, and thus having an effective understanding of history. To provide students with the tools to understand the consequences of stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations. To introduce students to new perspectives on history while sensitizing them to the distinction between fact and opinion, and teach students about the long-term ramifications of the Holocaust and its extreme persecution. And that is what this is all about, so that we can take my father's experience and his legacy and make it, as they say in the military, carry on. Thank you. These are the memoirs. The books are available on Amazon, and you'll see many of the letters and stories that go into the documentary. So you have some choices of resources to use.
Well, Deborah, thank you so much. First of all, I apologize again, everyone, but thank you all for your patience while we made sure that Deborah could rejoin us. I'm so glad that you were able to, because I always love to hear an experience of somebody who was there that I had not heard before. And so the opportunity to be with you and to hear your father's story and to gather these resources that you've created are so important. You know, before the call started, you and I were talking about my grandfather who also served in the Army during World War II. And, you know, I never really had an opportunity to talk with him. I was 15 when he passed, but, you know, he didn't want to talk about it. And a lot of these men and women didn't. And it really wasn't until the 90s you got this, large part thanks to Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks and their efforts to get this revival of, we have to hear these stories, and we have to, and that's when you start to get this motivation for folks who were there to share their stories as liberators. So thank you for that. I did want to ask you, you mentioned when you started working on the documentary and also writing, but how long had that been an inkling in your mind? When did you start to think, I might want to share Dad's stories?
Hmm. So when I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it was the first time that I had heard Dad talk about this. I told him, Dad, one of my roles as the community and media person here is I have to prepare Holocaust survivors to speak to the media because the Spielberg movie had just come out and they wanted to actually comment on it. And I said, do you know that these survivors have never even told their families their stories? And Dad says to me, well, I never told you mine either. And excuse me? And that combined with the FBI training me, had him hop on a plane from Cincinnati and come out to Tulsa. And I arranged for him to do a radio show interview about what he had done. And by the way, it is up on my website, American Diversity Report, under The Liberator's Daughter. That's the name of the first memoir. And people can hear him himself. So that kind of stirred me up, and I started asking for the letters, started to write. Very difficult to read those letters, let me tell you. It took years before I published that first book.
Also wanted to ask you, you mentioned that was difficult, but what were some of the challenges that you ran into when you were working on Untold, working on the documentary?
On the documentary, um,
Yes.
well, I had to choose. What is it that is most vital for people in terms of education, history, because I couldn't put two books and more into one hour-long documentary. And so piecing it together was very time-consuming and difficult. I am so grateful to Jewish Life TV for helping me with the graphics, and I'm grateful to my cousin Michael Levine, my dad's nephew, who is a composer in Hollywood, for composing the music to it, and for all the actors and the director of the radio show, which gave me the um, the audio to go with it.
Sure. Wanted to ask you as well, you mentioned your dad taking you, I believe you mentioned, back to Europe to see where he
Yes.
to see where he was deployed and where he traveled through. Was it difficult for him to go back there? Was that healing for him? Was he somebody who was very comfortable with that experience? And is that when you began to learn about what he did during the war?
It was an interesting time to go through England and then through France, to see where he had been, um, and then actually into Italy and Venice to see him talk to survivors. It was difficult for him, but most difficult was the idea of going back into Germany, which he refused to do. He wasn't going to take his kids, his family into Germany. Now, years later, maybe a decade and a half later, He went by himself back to Germany and wrote about it. He wanted to see what was going on, but he wasn't ready yet. He couldn't. He just couldn't.
Yeah, that's understandable. I think my grandfather had the same experience when it came to Germany. It's one country he did not want to return to. Um, and you can obviously understand why that would be. But nevertheless, yeah, I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Again, um, is there a way folks can reach out to you if they have additional questions online, or maybe if not, if they want to email questions to us, we can see if there's anything to send along to you. But I don't know if there's a way folks can learn more. Obviously, I'm going to share the links that you provided in the follow-up email that everyone will receive as well.
Yes.
So you'll have links to more of Deborah's resources there. But I just wanted to check with you if you had any resources in addition that you wanted us to share.
Um, the there is a page on the American Diversity Report for Untold Stories of a World War II Liberator. And if you go to that page, you can access the documentary and the training teaching guide, and also links to the memoirs. So that's all there on that one page.
Awesome. I just threw that in the chat as well, so folks will have access to that direct link as well. And I did see a question. This is being recorded. I'll clean up some of the introduction to make the recording a little bit shorter, and I'll include that in our recording archive later this afternoon. So wanted to let folks know about that as well.
Yes, and
Um, Yes, and we do have time for a couple more questions if you're willing, Deborah. I did want to ask Sharon asked a good question. How old was your father during the beginning of the Holocaust? And then I wanted to ask a follow-up on that, which is your father obviously worked in military intelligence. When did he start to have an inkling of what was going on in terms of the Holocaust?
so Dad was in his mid-20s when he went to Camp Ritchie and then was deployed into the Europe theater. He started to understand what was going on with the Holocaust when he got to Paris, right? But I will share with you that one of the interesting things about Bermuda, and it being British colony at the time, was that there was access, right, to all of the newspapers that were coming out of Europe. And so the reports were pretty graphic in those newspapers, probably more so than what Americans saw at the time.
That's a really good point. I think there's a misconception that folks just had no idea until the newsreels of the camps were coming out in 45. But it's worth noting that the first American newspapers had reports of mass killings as early as 42, before the gas chambers were even really built and operational. Back when the Nazis were shooting a number of people to death, it was being reported, and the news was certainly out there. And I'm sure, obviously your father working, being able to speak the language and being able to interrogate Nazi prisoners probably had advanced warning beyond everybody else. But still, I'm sure hard to comprehend the scale of that brutality. I can't imagine encountering that. Well, Deborah, we do just have a couple minutes left, and again, thank you so much. The timing worked out great. I hope we didn't rush you too much.
No, and
But
I would love to wrap up with one thing, and that is when my dad liberated the camp called Nordhausen. Nordhausen was hidden underground with a cross on the top next to a hospital, as if no one would notice it was anything but medical, right? And he said, Nordhausen was a wreck and also the scene of concentration camp leftovers. We saw over 2,000 bodies in one place. The sight and smell are still with me. And I think that that was part of his life. And I'm grateful that I can do this on his behalf.
Thank you. I think we all are. I certainly am. And again, grateful for his service and his story and the work that he did his whole life and the work that you've done your whole life as well to share this with everyone. Again, folks, Deborah's resources, linked to her documentary and those books will be shared in the post-webinar email that you're going to receive, as well as links to upcoming programming. Thanks so much for sharing your time with us this afternoon or evening. Deborah and everyone on the call, please do be well and have a great evening. And thank you so much again for being with us.
Thank you. And I look forward to hearing from many of you when you have questions. Please look at the contact in the bottom of the page. You can send me comments or questions. Look forward to it.
Yeah, we'll make sure that's included in the follow-up resources as well. So thank you all.